some observations, and I'll be making a few of those as I go through today. What am I going to cover? Well, I've been given an hour. You know, an hour's a fantastic amount of time to try and take you through some of the depth of the work that we're trying to do, and it is very much a work in progress. I think that's important for me to say up front. As we've kind of been doing, I've only just got some of the data from my colleague where we've been looking at differences between rural and urban communities. So that's hot off the press. We think we've found a way, because David and Sarah have been chewing our ears about this, around trying to identify any differences that there might be between coastal and not coastal. And we think we found a way of cracking that, but we haven't been able to do it yet. So that'll be one of the next pieces of kind of digging that we're going to get into. And when we get to the end, I'll kind of share what we're thinking of doing with it, and we'll get a bit of time to talk about that after our break. So these are the areas that I'm going to cover. I'm going to talk a little bit about demographics. I've got a couple of really interesting observations that you may know, but if you don't, they're so important when we look at this, when we go through some of the other data. I'll then talk about this adult population as a whole. Changes that COVID has impact on demographic groups. We've then cut the data by deprivation, and we've cut the data by urban and rural, and we've looked at the impact that's having on the impact, what's going on in different demographic groups when you look at it from a deprivation or from an urban rural perspective. That's where we've had to aggregate the data. What does that mean? Well, Humber gets a sample from Active Life survey of 2,000 adults over the age of 16 on an annual basis. It's basically 500 for each of the local authorities. We can only break that down to a certain extent in a single year of data, but if we put all 5 years of data together, then obviously we've got a 10,000 sample, and we can start to think about breaking it down. But you've just got to be cautious with that a little bit, because obviously we're looking at data from over 5-year period. We've also done, my colleague Martin creates this wonderful pie chart, and it's going to give you a sense of the different activities that people do to get their minutes, and there's a really bit useful one in there where you can start to see the shift in activities where people are getting their minutes from during COVID. And then I'll summarize, and please do ask questions, as Sarah said, as we go along. Put them in the chat, and if Sarah thinks I need to deal with them there and then, she'll stop me, and we'll sort them out. Right, into the demographics. We know, why are we looking at demographics? Well, demographics are really important for us to understand physical activity behaviour, and to understand this data that we get through the Active Life survey, because certain demographic groups are more likely to be active or not. And so the makeup of the population in Humber can help us think about whether things are going to be better or worse. So to bring that to life a little bit, Humber has got a slightly larger proportion of older people over the age of 50 than England does. And so straight away, older people are more likely to be inactive. So we'd expect Humber's, because of that, having a larger proportion of people over 50 in our population, we could expect Humber to have higher levels of inactivity when you look at the whole population data. To add to that, Humber's also got a greater proportion of people with limiting illness. It's got more people in lower socioeconomic groups. That's what NSX 6 to 8 means. It's a way of looking at people's qualifications and job status, and putting people into socioeconomic groups. And NSX 6 to 8 are what's known as lower socioeconomic groups. Although we've got fewer people from different ethnic minority groups. So when you look at the data and compare to Humber to England, it's a bit unfair actually, because Humber demographically doesn't look like England. However, the England marker is still a useful benchmark because that's the average across the country. But we should be expecting, when you see that demographic profile a little bit, you start to realise that actually we're expecting inactivity to be higher in Humber because we've got more older people, we've got more people, a greater proportion of people from lower socioeconomic groups, and we've got a greater proportion of people with a limited illness and condition. I'm going to unpick a lot of that as we go through. There's a couple of things that I need to pick up here, because the Humber population is changing and continues to change, and to just put that into kind of bring that to life for you a little bit. and I'm just going to look at my notes here because I want to be clear with the exact numbers. Over the last 5 years, the Humber has basically received over 1,100 over 55s every year from other parts of the country. So people over the age of 55 are moving into the Humber area, in particular into the East Riding, but not completely into the East Riding. So we're getting more older people from other parts of the country. Countering that, well, the Humber is losing over 1,500 16 to 34-year-olds on average every year for the last 5 years. And so to put that in simple terms, when we start to look at some of the data, we're losing a group of a part of our population that's more likely to be active, and we're gaining a part of our population that's more likely to be inactive. Okay. We've got a challenge in this space just purely from demographic change. And what this adds up to is the over 65 part of the population in Humber is projected to grow by 1/3 over the next 20 years. So I think it's really important that we think about age and what's happening with our middle age and older age groups when we go through some of the data, because our demographic is changing quite significantly, and what we don't know yet is the impact of the pandemic on that migration. So that's just to kind of set the scene up front in terms of demographic groups. Okay, so what's happening with in terms of active, inactive? Well, let me just make sure everybody knows what I'm on about when I'm using these terms, active and inactive. So this survey of 177,000 people across the country asked people whether
it's just that, like you just feel like you sat waiting, aren't you?
Can you put yourself on mute, please? Can you, if you've got any questions, please put them into the chat. Thank you. So what do I mean by inactive and active? Well, inactive is the chief medical officer for adults recommends that adults should do 150 minutes of moderate intensity physical activity in a week. Moderate intensity is basically you get your heart rate up, you get a bit warmer, you might start to sweat, and that's important for our cardiovascular health. So 150 minutes. If you achieve 150 minutes a week, then you're active. If you do fewer than 30 minutes a week, you're inactive. So 30 minutes a week is not a lot. If you're doing less than that, then you're in this group called inactive. I'll come back to that moderate intensity in a little bit because it's important. Okay, so what's happening in the Humber? Well, we've got over 3 in 10 people that are now inactive. We've got over 3 in 10 people that are doing less than 30 minutes a week. That's around 240,000 people in the population. So it's a significant challenge. We also know that during the pandemic, you've basically got the data points from each of the 5 years of data on here now. The red line is the inactive line for Humber. The green line is the active trend for Humber. And you can see that it was relatively flat. However, during this last 12 months, we've had an increase. That increase is pretty much in line with the increase nationally. We went up 2.5 percentage points nationally did inactivity. It's 2.6 in the Humber. And that equates to 20,000 more inactive people in that period of time, 1920 compared to 1819. However, that distribution of who is inactive is not completely equally spread, but you'll see that it is quite widespread when we get into some of the data. So the pandemic appears to have had a negative impact. It's not the case. I was mentioning earlier that I was in a conference yesterday in Lincolnshire, and in Lincolnshire that trend has stayed flat. So it's not the case that it's happened everywhere. But what's happened in the Humber is pretty similar to what's happened nationally, and the pandemic has had a negative impact. What does this look like when you look at things across each of the 4 local authority areas in the Humber? Well, that's the data. Red is inactive at the bottom, green is the proportion that are active at the top. The bit in the middle is what we know as fairly active. They're the people that are doing somewhere between 30 and 149 minutes, and you can see that there's quite a difference between our different communities when it comes to the level of inactivity that we've got, and that relates back to, you know, one of my earlier slides, that these four areas don't demographically look like each other to some extent. So that's going to be at play when you look at the data at a more local level. What does the trends look like in terms of the impact of the pandemic? Well, you can certainly see that it's had more of an impact in Hull and North East Lincolnshire from the data that we've got. The North Lincolnshire continuing a downward trend, which is really quite fascinating, and considering the circumstances, it'll be really helpful to get the next year of data and see if that's being sustained. Because if it's being sustained, we want to be looking at what's going on there. We want to be digging into that, because that's a real positive, especially given the evidence that the pandemic is having an impact. And then you've got the quite significant increases in Hull, I guess to be expected, really, you know, lockdown, urban area, etc., etc. So we can, you know, we might want to try and dig into that a little bit more at a later point. I'm just setting this up now because the next couple of slides we've looked at whole population data, but we've looked at it in through the lens of a couple of other factors. So one of the things that we've looked at is, have we got any differences between our neighbourhoods, our areas that are less deprived and more deprived, using the indices of multiple deprivation? So that's the map on the left. That basically, I haven't got a key on there because I couldn't fit it on, but basically the browner the area, the more deprived it is. The darker the green, the less deprived it is. So those really dark green areas are in the top 10 least deprived areas in the country. The really dark brown areas are in the top 10 most deprived areas of the country. And you can see how, you know, that obviously as the shades change, you're in these different places. You're in these in between the two somewhere. On the right hand side, you've got urban and rural classification. The grey areas are what are classified as urban areas, towns, cities, and urban fringe. So all of those grey areas are classified by ONS as urban areas. The purple areas are rural towns and rural fringe, and the green area is rural villages and dispersed. Okay, so basically all of the green and purple would be classed as rural. Okay, I'm showing you them just so you can get a sense of what I'm talking about when I look at these, because we've looked at the data through these two factors as well. So just moving on to IMD. So when you look at deprivation, in order to be able to, this is where we're using the aggregated sample a little bit, and we can't, because the samples 10,000, when you split that into 10 deciles, let's say it cuts equally, it doesn't, but let's say there was 1,000 in each, but we can't then break that 1,000 down a lot. So what we've done is we've put it into quartiles. The least deprived quartile, the least deprived 25%, the most deprived 25%, and then obviously the two 25% in the middle. And what you start to see here is, what to a degree, what we'd expect from the most deprived. That's where inactivity is highest, 35% in the Humber. And you can see the black dot is England, and you can see that it's several percentage points above the same data in England, the average in England. Look at the least deprived quartile, and this really struck us, because we'd expect inactivity to be lower there, and it is compared to our most deprived communities. But look how far behind England it is. That is like 25% worse than what the value is in England. So this is a part of our community that we'd probably expect to be a bit more active, and it is to a degree, but it's considerably behind England. So what you take from this is actually our inactivity challenge is spread across all of our communities, regardless of deprivation, because all of those factors are, they're all high. They're all quite a bit higher than England. So we've got this quite widespread challenge. So how can we unpick that a little bit more, and I'll hopefully kind of answer that a little bit later. rural, and this is a new one for this. This is literally hot off the press. This data is, and so we're quite fascinated with what's come out of this. So going back to those, so the red towers are in activity in our urban areas. So that would be the grey patches on that map that I've just shown you. The light pale blue is inactivity levels within our rural areas. So that green and purple, parts of the community that I showed you. And you can just see that it has flipped around a little bit, but generally inactivity is higher in our urban areas. Is the pattern, and that's particularly the case when you look in the most recent year of data, where it's kind of opened out to an 8%. We've seen that before in 2016-17, and it's back out to that now. So it's kind of reaffirming that whole shift that we've seen, that actually our urban areas have probably experienced a greater challenge in being active during this pandemic period, which is interesting. But this hides some really fascinating inequalities, which I will come back to a little bit later. I mentioned earlier that this chief medical officer's recommendation asks whether we are the activity that we do it at a moderately intensive level. So it literally asks, does your heart rate go up? Does your breathing, do you get warmer? Do you start to sweat? And this helps us just kind of understand this inactive group, because it's not all sedentary people. So we look at that bottom row is basically the proportion of inactive people in the Humber, broken down into 3 groups. The red group is our sedentary group. That's about 142,000 people in the Humber, and it's grown. That's grown by about 1.5 percentage points during the pandemic. So our number of people, our proportion of people that are sedentary has increased during the pandemic. And then you've got this 12%, this 11.9, which is about 91. These people are what's called light only. They're missing that intensity. What does that mean? Well, they're exercising, and they're not exercising vigorously enough. What would a big part of this group would be people walking the dog, walking maybe to and from work, and doing so at a way that when they answer the question, they say, no, it doesn't increase my heart rate, or no, I don't get sweaty, and they're missing that intensity. So they're in this inactive proportion, because to be active, you've got to get the moderate intensity. So it gives us hope, because there's a big proportion in here, 90,000 people that are already doing something. However, these people may already consider themselves to be active because they walk the dog for an hour a day, but the dog's always stopping and wandering around and doing what it does. And so they might have a very different perception of their activity levels, which poses as a slightly different challenge. That last little bit at the end is the proportion of people, it's only small, that are doing, somewhere between 1 and 29 minutes, which equates to about 5,000 people in the Humber. Okay, I'll stop there. Are there any questions so far that have come up, Sarah, before I go into the next bit?
Nothing so far, Scott, unless anyone would like to ask anything just now while we've got 5 minutes. Oh, got a hand up. Oh, Gary.
Yeah, hi all. Hi, Scott. Good to see you again.
Hi, Gary.
It's just the COVID data. You mentioned about the COVID facts, and I just wondered, with our area and particularly East Riding and what have you, having older populations, which were obviously affected more by COVID, whether that is shown in the data, and whether other areas that haven't seen the COVID impact, whether they're younger areas.
Hold it. I'm not going to answer that, because it would ruin my next slide.
Apologies.
Head of the game, Gary. Thank you very much.
That always happens, doesn't it, Scott?
Shall I continue, unless there's another hand up?
No, carry on, please, Scott.
All right. Okay. So this is going to start to help us answer Gary's question. What does this look like between different parts of our community? So going back to those demographic groups, we're going to start to look at men and women, those with and without a limited illness, different age groups, ethnicities on there. But sadly, I'll deal with this now. this is one of the frustrating things about the active Humber sample being 2,000. We really don't get enough responses from our more diverse communities. So we can't really do anything with that data yet. Obviously, when we get a couple more years, we might be able to do something with groups like, we might be able to start to aggregate the data and look at groups like white other, maybe Asian, maybe, but at the moment the data is still not strong enough for us to be able to do anything. It's one of the things that we're discussing with David and Sarah and other active partnerships in order to be able to have some conversations with Sport England about what we can do about it, because we've got to get stronger information in this area. And then lower socioeconomic status, so that higher, middle and lower socioeconomic groups, which we'll look at as we go through this. There's a few other bits chucked in here and there though. As we go through, you'll see it. Right, so this is those groups inactive last year is the kind of grey tower for Humber. Red tower is the latest year of data, 1920 for Humber, and then the grey diamond is England for 1819 and the red dot is England for 1920. And you can see a range of different demographic groups we've set out across there. And you can see straight away that that grey tower for the over 75s has increased in the Humber during the pandemic period. But really interestingly, limiting illness, the proportion of inactive has decreased. And basically, apart from the 16 to 34s, bucks the trend, which is quite fascinating. However, you see some quite large increases amongst our low socioeconomic parts of our community, that NSX 6 to 8. You see a really large increase for our 55 to 74-year-olds. Men's gone up quite some way. Women's gone up a little bit. Men have, and there's a greater proportion of men that are inactive now compared to women. And over the last few years, these two gender has been flicking around. Sometimes it's male that's a little bit higher, sometimes it's female that's a little bit higher, which would suggest that they're very similar. And you can just see how things have changed over the last 12 months. However, I just want to bring a couple of kind of additional factors in here that I think is worth considering. That increase in male inactivity is around 4 percentage points, and it's been driven mainly by a significant group that contributes to that is the over 75s. So going back to Gary's question, that inactivity amongst men over the age of 75 has gone up 5 percentage points. It's not quite gone up as much for women. So that increase in the 75 pluses is a lot of that increase has come from men. The increases in terms of from a male perspective across socioeconomic state, it's basically all of them have got a little bit worse, but just a little bit. It's kind of spread out across socioeconomic status. From a female perspective, that increase has come mainly from middle and lower socioeconomic groups. The lower socioeconomic group has gone up quite like 5 or 6 percentage points from a female perspective. So inactivity in our low socioeconomic communities has really grown amongst women that we need to be conscious about. Males have also seen quite a dramatic increase in the 35 to 54 age group, whereas women have seen a really quite dramatic increase in the 55 to 74 age group. I know I'm throwing lots of things at you here. There is a longer data pack that if you're interested in having a look at, that sets out all of this data. Believe it or not, even though it's 30 slides today, this is a summary. So if you want to look at some of this, it'll all be in that longer data pack. So please do get in touch with Sarah and we can share it. In terms of limiting illness, both men and women have seen decreases in activity. So both genders are contributing to that small decrease. And so, but that NSX 6 to 8 increase is mainly being driven by women. So we can get underneath this, and there's a lot, as I've mentioned in that other data pack, there's quite a lot of this secondary demographic data that you can look at. But I'm just going to pick on a couple of groups in a bit more detail after this slide. I've forgotten about this slide. David asked me David and Sarah asked me to keep this in. What we've done here is we've taken all of these demographic groups. There are 45 active partnerships that cover the whole of England. What you've got here is a league table, or several league tables for each of the different demographic groups. So in the top left, you can see that Humber comes third from bottom, i.e. third worst when we look at inactivity rank across the range of active partnerships. Keep in mind that the Humber, number one on that list is Oxford. The Humber demographically looks absolutely nothing like Oxfordshire. So you know, we're not doing it as a comparison. In terms of comparing to other partnerships, we do it because it just helps us compare the groups, and you can start to see some of the groups that are towards the wrong end of the table. And whilst our 6 to 8 proportion of inactivity is high, it's actually comparatively up the league table. However, our NSEC 1 to 2s, our bankers, literally our bankers, but this is our group that we rely on to be more active. It's people in chief executive jobs, professional qualifications, GPs, etc., more likely to be affluent, of course, more likely to be higher levels of qualifications. And actually, our inactivity amongst that group is actually quite high and compares not very well. You can also see the challenges that we've got in middle age, you know, from 35 all the way through to 74. That 74 group was improved. I'm stealing my own thunder there. You'll see what was happening with that 55 to 74 age group, but actually now it's probably the worst league position that we've got in that sense. So it just gives a sense of how we compare in other groups. No limiting illness worse than limiting illness, you know, in this league table. But what we do know, and we'll get onto that in a minute, is there's actually big, you know, you can look at the size of the towers of the bottom 3 compared to the size of the towers in the others, and you can see the inequality. You can see how much higher those group experience inactivity. There's a lot on this slide, but you're just looking at generally at the patterns. You can start to see now from these are the trends across all of those different groups again, and you can start to see what was happening in them. And then the dotted bit shows you the year that we've had during the pandemic. You can see how that 55 to 74-year-olds was on a positive trend. It looked to be edging downwards. Inactivity appeared to be getting better. And then the pandemic has come in and walloped it. And that is mainly driven by females within that age group. You can see that slight shift downwards in terms of for inactivity amongst those with the limiting illness and conditions. It just gives you a sense of how these things compare to the previous years of data. That 75 plus age group, it fluctuates around like that because the sample's not enormous. So when the sample is smaller for these groups, we'd expect to see greater fluctuations. It's still robust enough for us to be sharing and to be using it and to be thinking about it. Just want to get into this challenge that we have around lower socioeconomic groups. So these people are more likely to be in routine and semi-routine work or unemployed. When it comes to socioeconomic status, it stops at the age of 74. So that's why you can't see any 75 pluses. People that are 75 and over aren't put into a socioeconomic group. And so what this starts to show you is how much of a challenge we've got around inactivity within the lower socioeconomic parts of our community, because they're all over. You know, we've aggregated the data to do this, and they all come out at over 3 in 10, which is roughly the Humber average for the whole population. So you can start to see that even our young people, with younger adults within this socioeconomic status, are experiencing quite high levels of inactivity, a little bit higher than England. You can see some of those groups, females, for example, 35 to are very similar to England, and then you've got men that are actually quite some way behind England as an average. And so it starts to realise that across wherever the communities are that have people from a low, higher proportions of people from a lower socioeconomic status, we're going to be having higher levels of inactivity. It's as simple as that. Digging into limiting illness and disability, I brought this in. You'll have to just give me a minute or two to explain it. I'm getting a bit geeky, but we found this really quite helpful to start to think not just about limiting illness and people with a limiting illness and disability, but also our older population, particularly those getting into the 55 to 74. Because what the left-hand side chart shows you is it shows you 5 different kind of conditions that long-term conditions that Sport England, when you fill in the survey. It asks you if you have a condition. If you've got a condition, it asks you what condition you've got. And basically, people that have ticked this box, the red dot represents the average age of people that have ticked this box in the Humber. So people with a long-term pain, their average age of people that have said they've got a long-term pain condition in the Humber is 62.1 years. Okay, the blue line is basically the range. 95% of all responses that have ticked long-term pain will fall between the bottom of that blue line and the top of that blue line. So it also gives us the range. So it gives us a sense when these conditions start to become more prevalent in our community, so it just starts to help us think about, well, when does this happen and what does it, because what we know is as soon as people develop a condition, inactivity jumps, pretty much doubles. Okay, it has that much of an impact. Okay, and then if you get another condition, it jumps again. So we've got to be conscious that when the onset of these conditions within our population start to create inactivity, it's really quite striking. On the right hand side, you've got the proportion of people. Again, this is from the sample in the survey, not from health data. It's from the sample within the survey. This shows you the proportion of people over the age of 50 that said that they had one of those conditions. And as you can see across the board, Humber has got higher proportions than national people reporting they have these conditions in our over 50 population, which would go to some extent to explain why so these just help us to just explain why we're seeing some of the challenges that we've got within that 55 to 74 age group and older, of course, as well. Any questions? Any thoughts? Gary, did I answer what you needed me to answer?
Yeah, you did. Thank you.
Sarah, anything? Shall I carry on?
No, I can't say anything. If you'd like to carry on, please, Scott.
Okay. We're all right for time. Good. Let's go. So we've now, I've introduced those deprivation IMD and how that maps across Humber and looked at the kind of quartiles that we created for that least deprived communities, most deprived communities, and I'm going to start to look at how demographics play out in that a little bit, and then I've introduced that urban and rural classification, and again I'm going to start to look at how demographics play out within that a little bit. So let's just look at. I love this slide. I know there's a lot on it, but we've put it all on because we just think it helps to just see the pattern. So what we've got here is that model of our least deprived communities using IMD and our most deprived communities, and obviously the two quarters in between. And then you've got it grouped by NSSEC 1 to 2, our higher socioeconomic groups, NSSEC 3 to 5, our middle socioeconomic groups, and then NSSEC 6 to 8, our lower socioeconomic groups. I'm going to start on the left because what we can observe straight away on the left is deprivation, living in communities, neighborhoods that are more, are more deprived, impacts on activity levels, regardless of socioeconomic status. Okay, because that 18% in our least deprived communities is 5 percentage points lower than 23% in our most deprived communities, and you can see that pattern consistently across all socioeconomic groups. So deprivation impacts regardless of socioeconomic status. One of the things I'd just like to point out here, though, is just look at the gap between England and Humber in each of those socioeconomic groups in the least deprived quartile of our neighbourhoods. It's really quite striking. So what is going on? I think age will come into that. I think frailty will come into that. Rurality will come into it to some degree. But there's something going on.
Let me just stop you there.
Yep.
Barry said he can't see this slide. Can everybody else see the slide okay? I'm not really sure what to suggest.
Is it just Barry?
Barry, are you there, Barry? Can you see it now?
Yep, I've got it now, I think.
Oh, perfect.
Yep, so thank you. Sorry about that.
My
Cheers.
ITs are very limited.
Yep, got it.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Thanks, Scott.
It's all right. so you can see that what we going back to that widespread, you can see that it's across all of our communities, less deprived, more deprived. We have real challenges with inactivity, and what's interesting is there's very few dots so far, isn't there, where you see the England data being similar to Humber. Well, in our most deprived communities, lower socioeconomic groups, you know, it's actually one of the places where it's quite similar. It's still high though, and you can still see how deprivation impacts among our lower socioeconomic parts of our population, you know, as it increases as we go from left to right. But even within our least deprived areas, people from lower socioeconomic groups, still over a third that are inactive. And look at how far behind England that is. So we have really got this widespread challenge, partly related to socioeconomic status and partly related to age. Just coming to age, this is deprivation again by age groups. What I want you to observe on this slide and the next slide is the growth in the red towers. Now, obviously, our younger adults are more likely to, you know, be active than inactive, but you can still see how deprivation impacts across that age group as we look at it, and you can start to see that as we when you look at that kind of 35 to 54 age groups. But look again, we're getting this little pattern that our least deprived quartile actually worse than our second least deprived quartile, which I really find fascinating. So you can see, look at how the towers shoot up. And so when we start to look into our older age groups, we really do start to get consistently higher levels of inactivity. Again, just let me observe that 55 to 74-year-olds, how far behind, in least deprived communities, how far behind England is. It's really quite striking. And, you know, there's some real differences on here that we really do need to be thinking about and thinking about how we reach, because we've got this widespread challenge around inactivity. The least deprived quartile, limiting illness, is probably explaining some of the other factors that we've seen here. That difference is huge. We're relatively confident in that data as well. You can see the little eye, the little black eye that you've got there is the confidence interval. It's not that wide. So what is going on in our less deprived communities when it comes to people with a limiting illness and disability? You know, this data is combined, so it doesn't. The pandemic doesn't explain it, because it's obviously got the other 4.5 years of data before the pandemic. So there's something going on. Rurality is certainly something that comes into my mind. The coastal side of things, I'll come back to the coastal side of things in a minute, but there's certainly some challenges that we've got across our communities. Just getting into the urban and rural, as I observed earlier, inactivity tends to be lower generally in our rural communities than it is in our urban communities. However, that does hide some interesting patterns, and this is the first one. We've literally got hardly any inequality between men and women in our urban communities. The difference is coming from our rural communities, which I just find fascinating. And just look at how far behind England that female level of inactivity is with it in Humber compared to England. That's quite some way behind. But it's, yeah, you can start to see that actually when we do have a gender inequality, it's possibly more likely coming from our rural communities than our urban communities. Limiting illness, again, look at how equal these are for the those with a limiting illness. Very similar. The rural one being a bit further behind England. But what I would notice again here is the inequality between those with a limited illness and those without a limited illness is wider in our rural communities than it is in our urban communities. But I don't want that to hide the fact that they're both very, very wide inequalities. But there is slightly a wider inequality in our rural areas when it comes to limiting illness than our urban areas. When we start to look at it by age, you can start to see some of the 75 plus challenge that we've got, but also that 55 to 74. You can really start to see it, can't you? And those towers, we know the increase. We know it increases with age. That dramatic increase, though, is probably more. No, the jump between 35 to 74 is pretty big in urban areas, and then it gets bigger for the 75 plus. Whereas you kind of go up a little bit more gradually in the rural, but only a little bit, and then you get this big jump for 75 plus. So we can start to just unpick some of this data by the kind of type of community that we've got. And then we've got the lower socioeconomic status by urban and rural. The inequality here is quite similar between NSEC 1 and 2 and 6 to 8. But I was really intrigued by that middle socioeconomic group, and all kinds of things start to go through my head around those kind of jobs and the people in that. So they're kind of middle management, they're semi-technical skills, technically qualified, so those kind of jobs, are they more likely to have to travel and travel greater distances? What is it that's creating that challenge? Because it's not that much different to lower socioeconomic groups. There's a real jump up between the higher socioeconomic status and everyone else in our rural areas, where the stepping stones are a bit more gradual in our urban areas. So we just started to kind of unpick this, and then we put the two factors together. And I am just really struck by that least deprived parts of our rural communities having such high levels of inactivity. Probably, as I think the other slides have shown, it's driven by age and it's driven by limiting conditions to a degree that we need to be thinking about. But when you just go through all of this information, you just start to realize that yes, we can pick out some groups that are experiencing inactivity more so than other groups, but you can just generally see the pattern that even with groups that we'd expect to be significantly more active, actually we're seeing quite high levels of inactivity. So we've got quite a widespread societal challenge that we really do need to give some thought about. And it, apart from that 16 to 34, where you start to see comparatively much better levels of inactivity, however, you're still up at 3 and 10 when it comes to the lower socioeconomic part of that cohort. It still hides some really quite high levels of inactivity within what is comparatively good proportion of inactivity, proportion of inactive people. So across all of these groups, we've got a real challenge, and that's what we're trying to pick out a bit more. And I'd be really interested in your thoughts around. There's a life course challenge here, because we know nearly half of our children and young people are not doing enough activity to benefit their health. Actually, when it comes to children and young people data, and we've got if that's the area that you're really interested in, there's a slide deck and there's a presentation online where we've done a similar deep analysis to this, and you can go and have a look at that. We know that that's related to family affluence and ethnicity and so on and so forth. But what we've got is quite a significant societal life course challenge around inactivity. Yes, some groups need more attention, and we can certainly have some conversations about that. But actually, we really do need to be thinking about how we can crack that together. They're just one of my favorite slides. I've got quite excited about these. Martin, this is my colleague that does a lot of this analysis. Martin and Liz do a lot of pulling this information together. They to just try and help understand the impact of COVID on the way that people get their minutes. They've pulled together these pie charts. They take a little bit of explaining. So let me just have a go at that. What you've got on the left is England, the England pie. On the right is the active Humber pie. What you've got here is all of the minutes that people have done so whether it's a person doing 10 minutes of walking and that's all they've done, to somebody running a marathon every day because they've been doing the Marathon des Sables or whatever it might be, all of those minutes are in here. There's some challenges with cleaning the data, but I won't go into that technically right now, because it's not the minutes, the number of minutes that's important. It's the proportions. Okay, so what you get is In England, 47%, this is in the latest year of data, by the way, 47% of all minutes came from walking, which is identical to Humber, okay? But notice the difference. In England, 18% of minutes came from gardening, whereas 24% of all minutes came from gardening in the Humber. 9% from cycling in the Humber, 9% from fitness activities. Well done, Joe Wick, for probably keeping that a bit higher. And then traditional sport provides about 11% of minutes in the latest year of data, which is quite a bit smaller than sporting. And when you get into 2 or 3 percentage point differences, when you're doing this kind of analysis, that's really quite large. So we've got this, and we'd expect to see, you know, that proportion of traditional sport maybe being different to last year, and I will come back to that shortly. That traditional sport covers everything that's not in the others. So it's got all of your football, all of your cricket, all of your tennis, your rock climbing, your canoeing, you know, all of that is under traditional sport. Your running is in there, which would be probably a significant chunk of that orange piece of cheese. Fitness activities are your weight. It includes you going to the gym, it'd be doing your exercises at home, etc., your classes, etc., etc. And I think the others are relatively self-explanatory. Now, look what happens to the Humber pie. And it's by the way, this pie is a proper pie. It's got pastry all around. It's not one of these casseroles with a hat on. We don't like those in press red. What these pies show us is the change between the previous year of data and the latest year of data. Look at how all walking has reduced 3% of minutes, which is quite significant. That would be, and I don't know this, but I'm going to take a pretty good guess that active travel walking has dropped enormously, and it's been made up a bit by people going for a walk during the lockdowns that we experienced. Cycling's gone up, fitness activity's gone down, gardening has changed dramatically, traditional sport has changed dramatically. We'd expect the fitness and the traditional sport. These are the less COVID proof, if that's a term I can use, activities, because they're more reliant on services, on provision, on spaces that were closed, etc., etc. Cycling, walking, and gardening, all more likely to be able, you know, you can just go and do it. And what we don't know yet is how this is going to bounce back. We'll have to get another year of data and look at that. But even this next year of data is going to include that January lockdown, which possibly worse than the first lockdown. So we're going to just have to see what this means for how people get their minutes, what it means to how people create habits for being physically active, whether those changes that are going to come about are going to stick around. We can do some of this kind of analysis for different groups, for example. So we could look at whether what this pie chart looks like for the 55 to 74s compared to the 16 to 34s, and so on and so forth. We haven't kind of got to that yet. If people think it'd be helpful to their work, then we can certainly do it. We could certainly look at this to some degree at a local authority level. Again, if people think that'd be helpful, then you know, please do have a conversation with Sarah and David. Okay, so just to summarize, and then I'll just mention a couple of things that we're looking to dig at next. I've kind of tried to bring some of this language in as I've been going through. I think the Humber really does face a challenge with inactivity across the life course. We've got a societal challenge there, because even some of the groups that we'd like, that we know in other parts of the country are much more likely to be active, are showing higher levels of inactivity. Whilst we've got higher levels of inactivity in our urban communities, potentially more related to deprivation and greater numbers of people from lower socioeconomic groups, some of the inequalities are actually wider in our rural communities. So again, it gives us this one over the other. It's not one over the other, it's both. We've seen that the pandemic is having an impact. It looks like it's a similar impact to what is nationally. Whether that's got worse or not in the latest data, we're going to have to wait and see. So far, it's increased the number of inactive people by over 20,000. We're seeing a small increase in those people that are doing nothing. It'll be interesting to see what that pattern looks like in the future as well. It's over the last 5 years, it's been wobbling around quite a bit. But that latest year of data is the highest it's been. So it'll be interesting to see how that kind of trend evolves. We've certainly got a challenge across the lower socioeconomic part of our community, you know, and across most of the range of deprivation. We're seeing some challenges with that higher socioeconomic groups as well, particularly in our urban communities, which is something that we might need to be thinking about. We compare really quite poorly when we start to look at our 35 to 74-year-old age groups, particularly that 55 to 74, where it appeared it was on a fairly consistent downward trend. It seemed like it was improving, and then COVID has hit and wallop, it's jumped right back, particularly driven by women in that group. And then this, don't forget this, you know, this challenge that we've got in our shifting demographics, because it's the groups that are already challenging, both urban and rurally, are getting bigger. Not just bigger from our aging process, but bigger because the Humbers are a lovely place for people to come and retire and bring all their ailments with them. And so we need to get ahead of the game and start to be thinking about that and the implications of it. I think, oh, coastal, I nearly forgot. One, as I mentioned, David and Sarah have been asking us to look at coastal, and for when the survey does actually ask people whether they live in a coastal community, it gets like 20 responses in the Humber. So it's no use. We can't, even if we aggregate it, it just won't give us anything worthwhile to do anything with. So one of the things that we think we might be able to work out is to actually work with David and Sarah and anyone that's interested, really, to try and come to terms with an agreement around what is a coastal community. David and I have been throwing around the concept of, you know, within 5 kilometers of the coast, you know, and then can we, and I think we can now, because I think we've worked out how to do it, can we identify the sample that's come from that? You know, we need to answer questions whether Hull's in and Grimsby's in and etc. etc. And can we then look at how we can look at the sample from that? I think we can. I think we've worked out how to do it, because Sport England don't make it easy for us. They don't give you a this response has come from this community with, you know, this postcode. They don't do it like that, but we think we've got a technique for doing it now. And so if we can agree this community, we can then what we want to define as coastal, we can then look at whether we can get a bigger sample than the 22 a year, because I think there's more people that have come from it depending on our definition. And if we can then maybe start to look at coastal versus everywhere else, not versus, but compared to everywhere else, and whether there's anything of use within that data to help us with the decisions that we've got to make and the work that we've got to do. I think that's it. Let's stop me sharing my screen, and if there's any questions, I'm happy to take them.